sugarcane production for biofuels that they're producing in Uganda. So there's a highway going in. The companies are jumping in to make this corridor work, which is like clusters, and the Gates Foundation and the World Bank are saying, wait a second, how can we help include small farmers and villages all along this corridor? So it's like jujitsu. Jelly-dali, you're basically taking this thing that's occurring, joining in on it, could be useful, could be a new start for this. But the basic thing, the most important overview point, which I then, because Peter said, wait a second, Tom, don't leave anybody with this, your obsession about clusters, okay? So I obey you, okay. That the last point I want to make is that to harness the private sector's investment in this big transformation and do it according to these 10 blocks that we have, is first to understand the crucial role of the private sector in transforming this economy. That it's raising consumer and producer food security, and that policy could aim at reducing the risk and increasing the incentive for this investment, and that governments can enter PPPs where there's a win-win that's clearly identifiable for business, small farmers, and consumers. Thank you very much. No YouTube moment though. I'm still alive. That would have been great. Keep rolling, keep the camera. Isn't that great?
Thank you, Tom. I'm sure you are very excited about it, and you know why he loses his head that early. He gets excited very fast.
That's right.
Let me open the floor for questions. The issues that he has raised, either the declining consumption, right?
I think they all agree, so I should just go, right?
You can stay there. Yeah, then we have a first question. The mic is over here.
Thanks very much. Very interesting. Duncan McIntosh from Reardon. Where do you see, for the government policymakers focused on rice food security at a national level, where are they going to start, or how are they going to start thinking about issues like this, where they want to maintain national food security, rice for example, but they've got forces like this driving them towards greater diversification, allowing farmers to increase their incomes. They feel they have to stay, their top priority is self-sufficiency, but yet you've got the forces that you're describing in some ways pushing back against that. What are those, what's your advice to those policymakers?
I promised Peter I wouldn't say anything about rice. He says, wait a second, this guy doesn't actually know anything about rice. But I do have an opinion, as usual. And I think that several things. One is that clearly in a situation, whether there's a sectoral decline, in absolute levels or share levels, it's an extremely important product. And technological change in the product is extremely important. So I don't think that that will become less important over the next 20 years. I think, however, that there might be pressures because of declining prices of commodities that will occur with all this investment, that some of the smaller farmers will not be as viable as they are within this commercializing economy. And just subsistence rice production, as you see actually occurring, of course, in Indonesia and many places, is declining because people are driven out by costs. And so for example, in a project we just did in Luzon, we saw many rice producers had sold their land to mango producers, right? And you see this in vegetables in Bandung. It's very, very common that the rice areas where that was not viable then pass to vegetables and other kinds of diversification. But I would argue, secondly, that besides that possibly then concentrating rice production in the areas that will be most productive and most commercially viable, that over time, those small farmers that diversify or enter the labor market have a possibility of increasing their incomes. Or if they stay in rice, the thing that you see all around the world is that people that go into cash cropping that's not the subsistence grain tend to be the ones that spend much more on adopting new technologies because they now have a source of liquidity and a risk management mechanism that's involved in their crop management. Okay, so this has been proved there was an entire book on this in the late 1980s at IFPRI about agricultural commercialization actually redounding to the benefit of the staple food producers, even on their own farms. So they might increase the production. Secondly, you might find that the off-season cropping, occurs in some of these others, and they say like Gujarat, you're finding that there's an increase in the productivity of wheat production in, for example, Western Gujarat. At the same time, in the other season, they're doing vegetable production. And that's spurred by a joint investment in irrigation that allows there to be a win-win. So it doesn't mean necessarily that the small farmers will be pushed out. They could increase their productivity. But I think that the need to think about competitiveness will be very important. You know, relative, for example, investments in rice technology relative to investing in these other things. This was a very important topic that came up in Madagascar with this, I think it's called SARI or whatever it is. It's the low input, or I can't remember what it's called, but it's the low input sustainable rice, where Chris Barrett did a very interesting study of that, showed that they massively adopted this new kind of sustainable rice that was very labor intensive, and then disadopted it. That was what was not followed. They disadopted because there were alternative uses for their labor time and income that made the relative payoff of making this technology not attractive. And so I think that these sorts of changes will force or lead researchers, and you're probably already doing it and thinking about it, toward thinking of the rice choices not as a captive audience that must take whatever technologies, but they'll be comparing these to many other and possibly less risky or at least more attractive payoff technologies in other sectors. Did that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Peter?
He's going to tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're wrong. But you're right, you didn't answer Duncan's question. The question was, how do we get policymakers to understand that vision? And I would argue that history actually has a pretty clear example of how we do that. You generate surpluses of rice. The 80s, the 90s was the last time I think that diversification out of rice was the hot policy topic. But that's because we had big surpluses of rice. So I think the way we get policymakers to stop worrying about rice self-sufficiency is actually to crank up rice productivity, get back to a surplus world where people are really comfortable that there's plenty of rice out there, and then the policy attention is going to focus to precisely those kinds of diversification processes. Now, some of that's going to go on no matter what the policymakers think, just because that's the reality of the market forces. But if we're actually worried about what policymakers are thinking and doing, and we think they might be important in terms of the infrastructure, soft and hard, that we need to get productivity higher across the board, I still don't think there is any other way than cranking up rice productivity and getting ourselves out of this current mindset that the only thing that matters is rice. Right now, we do need more rice, and sometimes I think it's been a healthy redress of the attitude from the 80s and 90s.
Excellent. So you're the short-term first step, and my points were really the second-generation issues that should kick in once there's sufficient investment.
Precisely, and they're kicking in anyway because, as you say, that's the underlying market reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the gentleman at the back, and then I move forward. Microphone.
Thanks, Tom, and I'm quite impressed, as I'm sure everyone is here, about how promising a lot of these developments are. But there was a red flag in your presentation, and that is how there's increasing concentration and market power within, let's say, the retail chain, although you pointed it out, it includes the processing sector too. So, does it not worry you a little bit about some of these gains in productivity being absorbed by just increased monopoly or monopolistic power and leaving the sector maybe not as strong as it could be? Or is this, I'm sure you're going to say that there's lots of competition in the Asian region, but when you get into sub-regions and smaller markets, even though there's lots of competition at the national level, there isn't necessarily that much at the local level. So does this concern you, and if it does, what might you do in terms of public policy to deal with it?
Thank you. I think that my first answer will be the answer you supplied me, which is that, you know, for some time, let's say 20 years, there's very, very intense competition over most of these markets. And the competition tends to be, you know, probably what you'll find is that multinationals will win in the competition. And the multinationals will be increasingly from this region. You know, I assume there'll be a massive Chinese Walmart that will face off Walmart. There's obviously large supermarket chains that are rising in Singapore and Hong Kong and all these places that are powerful players within the region. So there'll be a multinationalization within the region and the increase of investment, competition. That is tending for quite a while to reduce prices to consumers. Where I think that it will have an effect is in squeezing, this is typical around the world and will increase over time, it squeezes the other segments of the supply chain. First action, of course, is disintermediation, where you find, and we're finding this in the mango sector in the Philippines, in the beginning of it, where you're basically finding that first, large wholesalers are buying directly rather than through sets of smaller wholesalers. You're finding specialized wholesalers are getting around traditional wholesalers. You're finding that processors, instead of working through networks of stockists, are beginning to have their own relationship directly with retailers. You're finding that the wholesale markets actually, historically one sees this many places, it's beginning actually in China, interestingly, but you find that they're an inverted U-curve where first they're very small in the fragmented market, then the wholesale markets increase and consolidate and become larger and larger, but then there's competition among wholesale markets and there's a peeling off of wholesale because of disintermediation, so that you find, for example, in Brazil, it's gone quite far. You have a decline of the wholesale sector over time, 20, 30%. In Mexico, it suddenly kicked in. But that's still 20 years down the line, I think, in the ASEAN region. And I think what happens third is that in the early stages, it's going to be very easy for suppliers, let me make sure I get this right, 85% of what supermarkets sell are processed goods and staples, etc. Right? And that's also the share of in consumption of those products. So supermarkets are not selling more of anything than the people are eating. Okay? 10 to 15% of the share of consumption is in fruit and vegetables. So they're selling mainly these things, and it's already squeezing quite hard the small and medium enterprise sector in many places. Okay? Because you tend to eliminate the ones that can't, you know, deliver the goods to your distribution centers, etc. So I think the squeeze will be first on the processing sector, and that squeeze will actually be exacerbated. I read something and I can't find it anymore, so I'll make it up, which is what a good academic does, is, you know, basically the Chinese government said, we expect that there'll be a 50% elimination of small and medium food enterprises in China with the institution of the food safety law. Okay, what happened in the United States? 1908, the largest food safety law in history was enacted. During that next decade, 90% of all of the small dairy operations in the United States went out of business. 90%. Okay.